On a hillside high above the Artois plain in northern France lies Notre Dame de Lorette, France's largest military cemetery from the Great War. In our latest Trench Chat, we're joined by military historian Mathilde Bernardet to discuss France's remembrance of the Great War and her work at the Memorial 1418 Museum located on those Artois battlefields. Welcome to another Trench Chat on the Old Front Line, and I'm really pleased this week to have Mathilde Bernardet from the Memorial 1418 at Lens, near Arras, joining us. Bienvenue, Mathilde. Welcome.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you.
So I always start these and ask people, what is your connection to the First World War? Where did your interest in it lie?
Well, I think that like many French, I have a personal connection to the Great War. I have a few ancestors who fought. Some of them died during the Great War. But like many French as well, it's a story that I didn't really know until recently. So my interest for the First World War is part of a larger passion for history, really. And I studied history, and during my master's, I started to focus more on the First World War because I was really fascinated by the experience, how these men left a civilized modern world to fight in trenches, to experience violence, death, and then went back to some kind of normal life. And well, slowly my interest went from this experience to the aftermath of the war. How do you cope with it, and all the consequences that this conflict had up until today, 2 3 generations later. And through my master's, and then through my work experience as a battlefield guide, through my job today at the Memorial 1418, this is what I experience almost every day. uh, Grandchildren, great nephews of First World War soldiers come to the museum looking for their ancestors, looking to understand what happened to them. So I guess my interest is really in that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that points to what we're going to move on to next. But the connection to the Great War is still very, very strong with people, isn't it?
It is, and that's really, I think that never ceased to amaze me, to see all these people still looking for an answer, still getting emotional about it. I had the chance to live in New Zealand for a while, and seeing that there, the memory of the Great War was sometimes stronger than in France, was really impressive.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you, how does France remember, really, I suppose, is the question I was going to ask, with more than 1.4 million dead and war memorials right across France and national days of remembrance in May and November every year, which are public holidays in France, aren't they?
Yeah.
How does France still remember?
Well, I guess they remember in a different way than British, than Australians, than Canadians do. It can appear to be more discreet at first, but in terms of structure, it's pretty similar. I mean, you have military cemeteries, you have war memorials in every village, you have a grave of an unknown soldier in Paris. Um, but I would say that the French don't have this such a passion for military history, maybe, and their approach to the Great War is more focused on grief than heroism. So they will look for their ancestor. They will try to retrace what happened to them, their war experience. But it's not so much something they will be proud of, I would say. And I think this difference is also a result of the way the military cemeteries were set up in France. The fact that many soldiers and non-soldiers were buried in ossuaries and don't have a proper grave, and there is no memorial to the missing, for example.
Yeah, I suppose that's right. And I think, I've seen in recent years more of an interest in war memorials themselves in France. I mean, they were always there, but now people are beginning to research some of the names on them.
That's right. Even on a scientific level, historians started to look more um, around war memorials, and people started to look for the soldiers who were killed in their and were born in their village. So we're starting to see this relation to personal histories, to because I think the French don't really relate to these big battles anymore. Battles like Verdun or the Marne, they've been used lately to promote Franco-German reconciliation, European construction, which is great. But I think people and French, like British, New Zealanders, like to relate to personal stories more than large battles.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned Verdun because when I lived in France, when I spoke to my neighbours about the First World War on the 11th of November, they would always say, "I don't understand why you're interested in it." And then I'd say to them, "Well, you must have an ancestor who fought there." And every single one of them just always said Verdun, whether they were at Verdun or not.
Yes. Well, Verdun, I think, well, almost it's of course the battle for the French, and many French fought, also French soldiers fought at some point at Verdun, and even if they didn't, it's just the emblematic battle for the French. But it's interesting because I would say that since the end of the Second World War, it has become more of a symbol of the suffering, of the violence of the industrial war, more than the resistance of the French army and the resilience of the French army. So there's been really a shift on the interpretation of the battle. And the French, I think, well, they found it difficult to be proud of this war, and they're really more about, well, look what my ancestor went through, what he suffered, and we have to remember this experience so it doesn't happen again.
So remembrance in that way has changed from the stoicism of determination of resisting an invading enemy to the catastrophe of the First World War and the immense losses in it.
It has indeed. Um, and I think that the Second World War played a part in that as well. And the memory of the Great War in France is problematic for that because, well, during the Second World War, the French Vichy government was led by a First World War veteran, and it really emblematic, general, the Marshal Pétain. And he really used this memory of the Great War and the veterans to to promote the Vichy government. So of course, at the end of the Second World War, this memory became problematic. And then you had all these brand new members of the French resistance, of the French army. So you had all this new layer of memory, of commemoration that really took over.
Yeah, and I think with war memorials, like you say, people focus on the names, but they're more than just names, aren't they? Because they can give us an insight into how catastrophic some years of the war were.
That's right. And I think that's an important part of my job at the Memorial 1418. Part of my job is to do ancestors research. And it's interesting because the battles that happen around Notre Dame de Lorette are not really well known in France. But if you look at the casualties, at the casualty rates, the violence of the fighting there, it's higher than Verdun, really, but most of the time forgotten. And it's really interesting to rediscover, for me, to rediscover this battle in Artois, for example, through the perspective of individual soldiers and what they went through, and to then explain that to people. And it's a really interesting way, through the biography, through the experience of a soldier. You can just talk about the fighting, you can talk about the weapons, you can talk about the medical system, you can talk about really many things. So it's a really good entry point to the history of the Great War.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that visiting, as we know, battlefields is what brings people brings their focus into remembering aspects of their own past, and then using that to understand the wider history of where they are and how their ancestors fit into that.
Exactly.
So, with your work at the Memorial 1418, I mean, obviously on your doorstep is Notre Dame de Lorette. It's the largest French National War cemetery from either World War, isn't it?
It is. It is indeed, with over 20,000 French soldiers buried in individual graves and 22,000 unknown soldiers in 8 ossuaries. And that's really one of the French specificities. I have to remember that big part of the Western Front was in France, and part of the country was ruined at the end of the war, and the French government had to make choices. Of course, the French government wanted to acknowledge individual soldiers, to give them a grave maintained in perpetuity, but the government couldn't maintain so many unknown graves. So they reused something that had been used at the end of the Franco-Prussian War, which is a kind of mass grave for unknown soldiers.
And then, like on British battlefields of the Great War, I suspect that at least half of the dead on places like the Somme and Passchendaele and Loos were missing, were unknown, and that would be the same with the French army, I would guess.
Yes, it's the same, and especially for the 1915 battles in the Artois area. But one of the difference with the British cemeteries is the Notre Dame de Lorette is actually the collection of 150 war cemeteries. So soldiers buried at Notre Dame de Lorette actually might have died in Belgium, in Artois, a long way from Notre Dame de Lorette. So there is no real connection or systematic connection between the battlefield and the place where the soldier is buried.
But I suppose that gives it a sort of a wider symbolism, doesn't it? Because it covers quite a lot of different battlefields, and there's every rank from private through to general, isn't there?
It is, yes, because the first grave when you visit Notre Dame, left side one of the Général Barbeau, and next to him is just a simple private, because the French cemeteries were really built upon the values of the Third Republic, and one of them was equality. So the French government made sure that every soldier was treated equally in the same way. But this was really didn't happen the way the French government wanted to, because some of the soldiers were repatriated. At the beginning, I guess the French government wanted to build large cemeteries, would just show the sacrifice of the country and be really impressive by the number of the soldiers buried there. But of course, at the end of the First World War, the French population wanted their soldiers back and wanted to grieve their soldier on their own terms. So it created some kind of tension between the French government and the French population, and the fact that the Americans decided to repatriate their soldiers. Well, the French government, after allowing the Americans to repatriate, had to leave the French repatriate their soldiers as well. So this a cemetery like Notre Dame de Lorette is interesting because it's on an emblematic, symbolic battlefield. It's really where the battle happened. But the soldiers buried there are not all related to this battlefield. So that's a problem, I think, for the French to relate to these battlefields and cemeteries.
Yeah, and your point about the repatriation of the dead back to family graves in the towns and villages and places that they came from, it means that when we look at a cemetery like that, it's only a proportion of the dead, and it's nearly 4 times as big as Tyne Cot, which is the biggest British and Commonwealth cemetery, as you know. But I think what it does, for groups that I take there, it gives them that insight into the sheer scale of France's losses in the First World War.
I guess it does really, and they were built that way to really show the sacrifice, the scale of the death, the scale of grief as well for the French population. But I think people don't always realize, in French as well, when they walk there, that they see all the crosses and headstones, but there is twice as much soldiers buried there, half of them being in ossuaries as well.
Absolutely, and the headstones that you mentioned are of the Muslim soldiers that were part of the colonial units that fought in the battles around Lens and Artois, and that's an important aspect of the Great War for France as well, isn't it?
Yes, it was. It was the first time that colonial troops were actually fighting in Europe or fighting on French ground. And what's interesting is the Third Republic made sure, the French government at the time made sure that the religion, the faith of these soldiers would be acknowledged and respected as early as November 1914. So it's quite interesting. Um, the colonial troops in the Artois area really 14, 19, 15, and well, almost took Vimy before they had to retreat. And at first, they were buried a bit scattered among the Notre Dame de Lorette battlefield, but in the 1930s, the graves were concentrated in the same area to be orientated in the right way according to the Muslim, to Islam.
And I think that people are often not aware of the contribution of Muslim soldiers in the First World War, both in the French army and certainly in the British army. And I think that seeing them together like that is a really important and powerful statement, isn't it?
It is really, and I think it reflects the way that they were integrated in the French army, and the fact that they really fought the same war and had the same experience. It's sometimes hard to retrace the history of these soldiers because well, the quality of treatment didn't really extend to the archives and the files, so it's sometimes hard to know who they were. And for example, they didn't, well, they could be repatriated, but obviously the French government didn't really make an effort to contact the families back in Africa or in the China to make sure that they could repatriate the soldiers. So most of them are still here. But I think that's important. They're still here and still visible to remember that it was a world war and it was an whole empire that fought this war.
Now, aside from the graves and the ossuaries in the cemetery, there's two other quite substantial features, isn't there? There's the chapel and the lantern tower.
Yes. So they were not meant to be here, just like the ossuary of Douaumont at Verdun. It's interesting because the French government didn't have a proactive policy in terms of cemeteries. They were really focused on winning the war, and after the end of the war, they were focused on rebuilding the country. So I mean, it's obvious for anyone who's been to French cemetery and Commonwealth War Grave Cemetery, they are really different. And the French cemetery were built, set up to be to last, to be cheap, but to acknowledge the sacrifice of the soldiers. But they were also meant to be secular or to respect the faith of the soldiers because French is a secular state since 1905. So there was not meant to be a church in a military cemetery. The center of the focus was meant to be the French flag. But in really important places like Notre Dame de Lorette or Verdun, um, members of the church, generals were more on the conservative side and quite strong Catholic as well. They pushed to create memorials, proper memorials and monuments, often with a religious side to commemorate the soldiers. And when it comes to Notre Dame de Lorette, there used to be a church and a chapel before the war, and it was quite important in the area. There used to be a pilgrimage every year. Many people would come there and gather every year. And even before the end of the war, the French soldiers rebuilt some kind of chapel on the hill. And at the end of the war, the local Bishop Julien, pushed to rebuild some kind of church on the hill. And well, the French government didn't pay for it. He eventually agreed to it, but refused to pay. So it's an organization that was created and subsidized, and it's mostly widows, the daughters of the soldiers buried there, who contributed to build the two buildings. And it's interesting because, well, you have a church, a chapel, But just across from the chapel, you have this lantern tower. And that's a project that was meant to be all over the Western Front. Some veterans organizations pushed to build lantern towers all along the Western Front to light up the former front line every night. Well, in the end, only a few were built, one at Notre Dame de Lorette. And this lantern tower is more a secular symbol. It's the idea that this light is protecting the soul of the soldiers buried here every night.
Yeah, it's a lovely thought. I remember reading in one French book that describes it as beaming out across the Artois plain to light the souls of those who'd fallen in the war.
Yes, it's a really it's an old symbol. It goes back to Roman times. In medieval times, some churches in France had this tower. This lantern tower was meant to guide the soul of the people in the right direction, the direction of the church. So it was reused, but more in a secular way. And this lantern tower is symbolically built upon the larger story ossuary of the cemetery. And in this ossuary, it's you mostly have unknown soldiers from the Artois battles, soldiers who died directly in this area. So it's a very strong symbol, really.
Yeah, and they've added unknown soldiers from other conflicts in there as well now, haven't they?
Yes, and that makes Notre Dame de Lorette really special as well. So you have you have a crypt and a few unknown soldiers from the First World War, but in the 1950s, the remains of unknown soldier from the Second World War was buried here as the ashes from someone who died in concentration camps. And then in the 1970s, the remains of an unknown soldier from Indochina and from Northern African wars was brought here. And that's the only place in France where someone from the Algeria war is actually commemorated. So it's really important. It makes Notre Dame de Lorette a really special place. And I think it's also related to the fact that there is an organization, the Guild of Honor at Notre Dame de Lorette, was created back in the 1920s to welcome and help the relatives of the soldiers to find a grave. And they're still here today, and most of them are or were veterans.
We meet them on a regular basis. They're always very helpful for our groups when they go there, and very respectful as well. It's a nice thing to have a little bit like the Commonwealth War Graves Commission interns at some of the British sites to have somebody there to talk to and ask questions. It's very good. It's very good. In the chapel on the walls, there's quite a lot of private memorials, isn't there, to soldiers?
Yes, I think it does show how important commemoration by name was for um, the relatives of these soldiers. So these names are some of the missing soldiers who died in the area. It's sometimes it can be a bit different, but that's the general idea. And most of these memorials were paid for by families who contributed to the chapel and to the lantern tower as well. And it's really important. I guess it shows how important it was for the families to have a place, to have the name of their soldiers somewhere. And amongst the name, there is, for example, one of the first winner of the Tour de France, François Faber, who was originally from Luxembourg and volunteered during the Great War and was killed somewhere between Notre Dame de Lorette and Vimy Ridge, and is still missing today.
Yeah, and I think quite a lot of them are missing soldiers, aren't they? You were saying that there was no memorial to the missing as such, and this was a way for families to commemorate those missing men.
Yes, there is no equivalent to the memorial of to the missing in the French system. What the French government did at the time, it concentrated the graves of the unknown soldiers, and commemoration by name was meant to be in registers livres d'or that were meant to be kept in every town hall in France. So this project started but took a long time, and the French never really relied to it. But the French government also subsidized the local war memorials. So the idea was, okay, they won't be commemorating on the battlefield, but they will be in their village, which also explains why the French still focused on local war memorials, maybe more um, than war cemeteries, because when you have a soldier who is a missing soldier, uh, going to a nursery really doesn't make any sense to help grieving.
No, no. And with the burial of the unknown warrior in France's unknown warrior at the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, did that have the same impact in France as the equivalent did in Britain?
At the time, I would say so. It's interesting because as I said, the French government at the time didn't have a proactive policy. So it's really when the British decided to do this non-warrior grave that the French quickly decided to do that as well. And at the time, I guess for many French, it was an important place to go to, and still important in France. There's still services organized every day at the grave of the unknown warrior. But at the same time, the French government maintained the grave of the soldiers in perpetuity, and gave the right to the family to go to the battlefield once a year. They paid for it, and it's still going on today. So if you can prove that you have a relative buried somewhere on the Western Front, the French government will give you a free train ticket every year to go there. So even the family of the missing could go to the battlefield and go to that place. So I think, yes, the unknown warrior as a symbol is really important, but probably people relate more to local war memorials and maybe the actual battlefield as well.
Now, in recent years, in the centenary period, as well as the French National Cemetery at Notre Dame de Lorette, there was the addition of the Ring of Remembrance, the new memorial. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes, it's really beautiful memorial. I think really great idea. It was an idea from the Northern District, Northern France local council, who decided to commemorate every soldier, and more than that, every man and woman who was killed or died in Nord and Pas-de-Calais area between 1914 and 1918. So it's a beautiful memorial commemorating the name of over 580,000 men and women who were killed in the area during the Great War. So it's just a list of names, but the building, the architecture is wonderful, and the light in it is really nice, and it really renewed the interest for the area. It's very interesting because Notre Dame de Lorette was not that visited before the centenary, and this Ring of Remembrance really brought new people to the area and renewed the interest for British Commonwealth countries as well. And more we see people coming for the Ring of Remembrance. We also see locals coming every weekend looking for their names, and it's an interesting way to rediscover history of the Great War as well, because you find your name and then you'll start looking and rediscover the story of a soldier, and then maybe discover some ancestor who fought and died during the Great War.
And it is just a list of names, isn't it? And it's every nationality that took part in the fighting in northern France.
It is. Well, it's the French, British Commonwealth countries, and the Germans as well, all at the same level. There's no difference. You can't tell the general from the private, or you can't tell a French from a German. So it's really really nice idea. But yeah, it's sometimes hard to discover the stories behind them. So at the Memorial of 1418, we have this database where you can find some basic information on the names commemorated on the Ring of Remembrance.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you about that, because that's sort of the part two to it, isn't it? That people go there and they see a name and think, well, because I've had it with British groups, they see a family surname on there that they didn't know that there was somebody with that name who died, but they can come and see you at the Memorial 1418 to find out a bit more, can't they?
Of course, that's also what we're here for. So there is a database, and people can just type the name, and there will be some basic information, and then we can do for them some more research and locate a grave or find out what happened really. So it's really a starting. The Ring of Remembrance is a starting point, and then at the memorial we can offer all the resources to help find more.
And so at the memorial, because I think that perhaps not as many people as they should do know about the memorial. It's a great place. I mean, as you know, we take our ledger groups there,
Yes.
and it gives them a good insight into the fighting in that part of northern France and the impact of the war on the locality in terms of destruction and then subsequent rebuilding and so on. So, tell us a little bit more about the Memorial 14 18.
It used to be called the Lance 1418, but it was a bit confusing for people. It's not actually in Lens. It's still a fairly new museum. It opened in 2015, and it really focused on the First World War in Nord and Pas-de-Calais, so in northern France. One of the specificity of this area is that French and British armies fought in this area side by side, and then after 1916, the British army handled this part of the front line. So the museum really shows that it's not French focused or British focused. You'll see as much French as British as German side of the history. And the other specificity of the museum is the fact that the collection is based on photographs. Photographs from official collections, but also private collections. And some of the photographs are on display at the museum for the first time. And the museum is really following the war from 1914 to 1918, but I think it's also focusing on interesting aspects, the life in the trenches, and also some things that are not often discussed, like the German occupation in northern France. Um, and as you say, the amount of destruction in northern France and all the rebuilding that took part in the 10 years after the end of the war. So it's really pulling back the war. Um, it allows to talk about many things around the First World War through the perspective of the area. And usually people like it.
Well, I'm not surprised. I mean, I really like that you've got it's like a big iPad with all the aerial photographs on, and I absolutely love aerial photos. And I could spend hours just looking through what's on there. It's quite an interactive museum.
It is really, you have a few interactive maps as well, but this giant iPad that unfortunately we haven't been able to use this year due to COVID
Oh no.
restrictions, but
Oh.
hopefully we'll be able to use back soon. I think one of the strengths of this museum is the views, the photographs. It's really visual, so you don't have to read much to understand what happened, and it really helped people understand the scale of destructions. And these aerial maps are really good, and photographs are really good, and even locals, I mean, like to come and have a look at the village where they live and see what it was like a century ago.
Absolutely, and we'll put some links on the podcast website to the memorial so people can find you, and hopefully when our lives are all back to normal,
Yes.
whatever that's going to be beyond this year, then they'll be able to make their way and come and see you. I mean, you live in northern France, so you live effectively on the battlefields. Where do you like to visit? What battlefields, aside from Notre Dame de Lorette, do you find impactful or important?
Well, that's a really good question. Uh, I guess as a battlefield guide, I spend a lot of time in the Somme area, around Ypres, Ypres as well. So it'd be the two battlefields I'm most familiar with. But probably won't surprise you that as a French, Verdun remains the more, probably because it's the most impressive battlefield still visible today, I would say. But they're all really different and interesting in their own way, really. And in the last couple of years, I've been focusing more on the French battlefield, which is interesting because I really started through the British side of the battlefield, and now studying more the French side of it is really interesting for me. It's different. So yeah, I would say that every one of them has its own interest.
Good. I mean, it's good that you're doing this study on the French battlefields, because I think it's a missing part of a lot of people's knowledge. I mean, most British visitors, they come, like you say, to Ypres and the Somme, and sometimes they do that bit in between from Armentières down to Lens and Arras, but more likely those two big battlefields. But there is this rest of the Western Front, several hundred miles of the line where the French army was, and people just are not aware of what is
Yeah.
there.
No, I heard some interesting things sometimes during tours about. But by the way, what were the French doing during the Great War? So I found it quite amusing because, of course, it's we all have this national focus, and I have to admit that as a French, I didn't always know that Australians, New Zealanders fought on the Western Front. So we all have this national focus, and I found it really interesting to extend that. And being a French battlefield guide for British Commonwealth countries was really interesting in that way, because I could bring more awareness about what the French did during the Great War, and where they fought, um, and what they did.
Absolutely, because I mean, if you look at pretty much every British and Commonwealth battle somewhere along the line, we can look to our right or to our left, and there's some horizon blue, and the French army are there.
Yes, and especially around Notre Dame de Lorette and Luz and all this area. That's really an area where the French and the British fought side by side for almost 2 years. So it's really interesting to approach that through this perspective, and not only talk about the French or the British, but remember that they were fighting together.
And we're beyond the First World War centenary now, but there's still clear evidence that people are continuing to be interested in the First World War. It's not going away, is it?
Well, of course, it's a big working in remembrance tourism industry. It's been the big question for the last years. I'm not worried, really. I think, of course, the centenary brought a lot of attention on the Western Front, on First World War in general. And I think in France, it was the end of this process that started at the end of the 1980s, early 1990s, where the French started to rediscover the history of their grandfather, rediscover letters, books, photo albums, and everyone started to publish personal stories. And it just went on, and the centenary was really a great moment for that, for the French to rediscover, to share their personal stories around the First World War. But I think it's still going on. It might not be as visible, but for example, at the beginning of this year, I started to put this form online to allow people to research their ancestors, and it's been a great success. Had over 100 requests since the beginning of the year. So the French are still looking for to understand what happened. And I think that once we get over this COVID pandemic problem, hopefully British, Australians, New Zealanders, Canadians will come back, and I'm sure the interest is still there and will still be there for many years.
I get the sense from social media that people are desperate to get back to the battlefields, that they're missing them such a lot. And I mean, I managed to sneak over to Flanders in July, but this year has been probably the least number of times, or the smallest amount of time that I've spent over there. And it's quite hard when it runs through your veins, really, and you're desperate to get back.
Yes, it does, and even for me, because for most of this year I was not allowed to go more than 1 kilometer away from home. So it was really frustrating to not even be able to walk the battlefields at just 10, 15 k's from home. Yes, and I think that's we all realized this year how much we were attached to the ground, to this area, and how we need that really. So hopefully next year we'll be able to all go back and enjoy it.
Well, yeah, I hope so. Yeah, and I think it's important as well that it's all part of ensuring that the story of this and all those men and women that were involved in the Great War and the impact that it had on so many different nations, Britain, France, Germany, and many others besides, that's not forgotten, and it's continued to be understood. And I think, as as you've hinted at, with new generations coming forward, we're seeing new interest and new interpretations as well.
Yes, that's right, and I think that's big part of our job now after the centenary to make sure that the memory still goes on, and to find new way to interest people. So at the Memorial 1418, we see many children studying the First World War at school coming to visit the museum, Notre Dame de Lorette, Vimerage. So it's also important to find a way to interest them. And one thing we've been doing at the memorial this year is to focus on personal stories. So we picked up a few people commemorated on the Ring of Remembrance and retraced their history. And I think it's an interesting way to create an interest for people who even live in the area, who think they know what happened there, and to create an interest or renew an interest. And we've been focusing on hikings as well, like small ballads around the battlefields, because many people who grew up in this area, of course, grew up with that, and all the things that happen here, and are used to collect things in the fields, but they don't always know what actually happened or who fought there. So it's an interesting way, I think, to start from personal stories or local events and go from there.
Well, it's history on their doorstep, isn't it? It's and it's big history as well, that and with some incredible stories.
It is, and I'm not from this area. I grew up in central France, and where I grew up, it was memory on my doorstep was really the French Resistance in the Second World War. So it's really the history I grew up with. But coming here, it's fascinating here to see how much the Great War is still alive here. You just can't ignore it. It's in every field. You just have to look around. You'll find a cemetery. You'll find memorial. It's just everywhere. It's been a century. And it's still so so present. And I guess many people around here will find it easy to relate to that history in so many different ways.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Mathilde. It's been fascinating to talk to you. I could talk to you all day about this, to be quite honest with you. So we'll have to get you back on the podcast at some point. I'm hoping that next year, when it is possible to travel again, and I'll be over with my portable recorder and we'll do some recordings on site. So perhaps we could have a walk around those graves together and you could tell us a bit more about some of the history. That'd be great.
We'd love to.
Good. Well, thank you so much. I'll put some links to the Memorial 1418 on the website, so people can find you. And thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks, Paul, for the invitation.
Thank you. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening.